In this lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at the role of social relationships in systems of social control, specifically looking at social bonding and social control theory. When we more closely examine social bonding theory and the establishment of self-control and how sociologists traditionally look at systems of self-control, a good starting point is the work, in this case, of Robert Agnew. He is best known for his theory of social strain, sometimes referred to as a general strain theory. And in the Agnew work, and again, it's more recent, so his published material that really addresses general strain theory is associated with 2006. When he's looking at social strain, what he is attempting to do is he is attempting to, in a sense, marry two concepts. One, the idea of social structure and the normative qualities of that social structure, and in this case, deviant behavior. So he's taking a look at, in this case, the nature of an individual and or a group within a larger society, where they fit in that society, looking at it from a socioeconomic point of view, or taking a look at it in terms of a class level, or taking a look at it in terms of access to particular kinds of resources within that social environment. And then he is assessing strain. And strain in this case is going to be directly relatable to stress. And so the concept of social strain and ultimately stress will then very quickly bridge us to the notion of self-control. So when you find yourself in a situation where you are experiencing a high level of stress, discrimination is a very good example of this. If there is a discriminatory act that is occurring, and you are at the center of that. You're feeling devalued, you're feeling that you do not have equal access or opportunity based upon some poor presumptions or some prejudices. It will result in you, the individual, experiencing a certain level of social strain. Robert Agnew is not necessarily looking judgmentally at the cause of the strain, even though that is important. We will want to deal with cause, but he's looking more closely at how you are coping with that kind of strain. Now, one environmental piece that is very closely linked to this idea of strain theory, and of course very closely linked to what Robert Agnew is writing about, is the idea of disorder. If we are dealing with a social setting that is in complete disorder, meaning it is in no way, shape, or form conforming to traditional models of social order, then we are dealing with an environment that is highly fluid and one that, by its nature, is filled with examples of strain or stress. Another good example of this would be a neighborhood where there is a high level of violence, or there is a high level of theft, for example, or a high crime rate, or a particular kind of crime is occurring in a neighborhood setting. The neighborhood itself represents environmentally a space of social disorder. And so Agnew and others, again, theorists looking at this, are saying, well, what can be put into place to be able to bring order back to this setting? And can we do it in a way that is or would not in any way, shape, or form violate anyone's civil rights? If anything, we would want to do it in a way that helps people or empowers people in a sense, provides people with the tools, removes particular kinds of environmental cues that are a source of disorder and strain. So the idea here is that if you are environmentally dealing with a situation, and this is why environmental theory also connects very strongly with this idea of the need for strong and, in this case, healthy social bonds, and the idea of the need for social order, usually there is an environmental component to it, or we approach it environmentally. Now, the concept of strain is something that is primarily individual. Disorganization, strain that comes from disorganization, generally will impact the individual. The individual is the primary and more functional unit of analysis in the application of this theoretical point of view. The idea here is that something in the environment, something in the conduct that surrounds an individual, is barring them from being able to achieve what they desire. Um, and this idea of being almost disenfranchised from the means to be able to achieve one's goals is seen as probably, and again, Agnew writes on this extensively, it is to him the most important ingredient for what eventually becomes a potential for criminal activity or for the potential for individual motivation that is seen as unhealthy. But as we know, when we're looking at the idea of achievement, or when we're looking at what an individual believes to be um, the important outcome of a particular social setting, these normative expectations or these individual expectations are generally established by the group and the society. So when we talk about strain theory and we talk about, in this case, testing important bonds in our society, or um, situations where an important social bond is not present that may aid an individual in achieving a goal and or dealing with, in this case, social strain. The group, the society, they are setting or establishing the rules for this process. They're setting the standards for this process. Now, groups themselves can also experience a certain level of social strain. And if we go back to the general concept of discrimination, we can have entire groups, again, defined by the larger society, both internally and externally, on a variety of, or based upon a variety of characteristics um, or factors. A group in itself can also experience a pretty high level of strain. A group can feel that because of these structural discriminatory kinds of practices that we find in, let's say, a system of law or in a political worldview, they, members of this group in this case, are not um, having equal access to the resources that they believe are necessary for their survival and for their quality of living. And so you can have strain being experienced by the group as well. Now, delinquency or deviant behavior, though, is an individual response to those particular kinds of experiences. And at this point, too, we're going to start to bridge into the idea of juvenile delinquency because, again, if tools and practices and roles are not established early on in important places within the broader landscape of socialization, young people will be in a position where they are unable to establish a high level of self-control, and they will not find themselves in a position where they are able to deal in a normative fashion with a particular level of social strain or social stress. In this case, criminal or delinquent behavior is the result of that process of strain and one's reaction to social strain. In this case, acting on anger or having resentment for a particular kind of situation can lead to antisocial or criminal practices. Robert Agnew's work then begins to highlight three main areas where strain can occur, or three areas where strain, social strain in this case, are experienced. And so we'll go over those three in this slide. So the first, and the one that is constantly occurring, and the one that sometimes will occur in relation to the other two, is individual strain or internal strain. This is where we have a particular personal perception regarding what we expect in a social setting, and that expectation is not met. And so the situation here results in strain being experienced by the individual. And this is where the concept of self-control as it relates to social control theory now has to start taking effect. And that may or may not occur depending on the socialization of the individual and the capabilities of the individual to be able to deal with that level of strain. A second type or a second area where strain will occur is when we move beyond the individual and the individual begins to, in a sense, experience a loss of stability in the world that they exist within. So when there is some sort of major social structural change within the life of the individual and or the group, where strain then begins to manifest. And I think, again, structural discrimination is a very, very good example, at least how people experience it and ultimately how they react to it. And then the third and final type that Agnew and others who focus on strain theory recognize is this concept of a feedback system. So once social strain begins to work its way into the life of an individual or a group, there is a feedback system that begins to generate, and we start to see personal and group relationships decline. We start to see bad choices being made, and we start to see social bonds break down, and we start to see social relationships that we would consider to be maybe uncharacteristic of an individual or group members. We see these start to take effect. And so variables that can be measured in relation to this third type of social strain could be things like grades at school. It could be, in this case, if we're dealing with, again, a young person, their interaction with the law and the court system. So these would be areas or variables that we would want to take a look at to determine whether or not the person has the right kinds of tools and the right kind of environment to be able to deal with a certain level of social strain. And when that is not occurring and it's being compounded environmentally or through social bonds or a lack thereof, then we look for this kind of negative feedback loop that begins to work its way into the process. And again, when you're talking about the work of strain theorists, you're talking about the work of people who are actively looking for solutions, in this case, to a particular kind of social problem. And so the idea here is that, when you see community centers being built, when you see youth programs being initiated by community members, these generally will be or will fit the category of being able to counteract social strain and some of these negative feedback systems that we see develop in and around the environment where young people and even young adults are experiencing, in this case, an uptick in delinquency and deviant behavior. So because strain theory is very much focused on this notion of solutions, finding solutions, implementing solutions as a way to counteract upticks in criminal behavior, we should take a closer look at some of the major areas within this solution-based approach toward criminal justice. So the first one here is probably the most important and the one that is most frequently experienced on a community level, which is equipping community organizations and the families that live within them with the means of being able to address it. An awareness, for example, or an awareness campaign regarding things like suicide can be a very good example of this. Developing more community centers for after school programs and things like that that would be or would fit this first solution based approach toward strain and stress in the community. A second area that is also pretty popular and one that cross-pollinates from social theory into criminal justice is the second one here, restructuring the criminal justice system itself. The idea here is that you can have local municipalities put programs into place, after school programs, things like that, that help to connect young people and individuals throughout the community in a peaceable manner with the criminal justice system. And so we see a lot of that, especially in our larger cities here in the United States. A third approach in terms of a social solution, providing communities with organizations that in their own right provide safety for people experiencing a certain degree or level of social strain. So the idea here is that, again, for example, a Boys and Girls Club and their ability to not only offer a safe place to be after school is over, but also to provide programs equipping young people, in this case, with um, the tools to be able to succeed, not only in a school environment, but in a social environment as well, and also equipping them with the tools to deal with or cope with a certain level of strain. And at this point, I should mention too that when you're dealing with an application of social strain theory and when you're looking at social bonds as they relate to control theory, at least in sociology, it's going to very much be focused on juvenile delinquency. But these are concepts that can and have been applied to a wide range of, in this case, age levels. Fourth one that I have here, sharing social support practices. So the idea here, and this is a real kind of key, is the idea that social support and the means of being able to aid people who are at risk. This is something that is probably the most inclusive of all of the categories of solution types. This can take on many different forms. You can have the development of group homes in neighborhood environments. You can also, in a sense, provide um, enrichment programs at a variety of age levels, free education, educational outreach programs, things like that. You also, in a sense, will begin to see with social support practices a greater connection between, in this case, criminal justice agencies and local communities. So a neighborhood watch program fits into this social support kind of practice category. So this fourth one here is very much kind of the tools of the trade when it comes to dealing with social strain. Unfortunately, this fourth category is also an area that directly addresses the link between strain and criminal behavior. So given that connection between social solutions and the wide range of practical applications involved in providing those and pushing those out to community members, we'll focus very much on that, and we'll see how that connects to two main things. First, the idea of maintaining and establishing and maintaining systems of social control, and the other, and this is the one that makes it a very powerful concept in criminological theory and its application, which is the curbing of strain, right? Being able to recognize sources of potential social strain early on and to be able to, in a sense, remove power from those situations to decelerate those situations so that people maybe never have to deal with a certain type of strain. Now, Ronald Akers and Christine Sellers, in their examination of social bonds, social associations, or the associations that we have, and control theory, address the nuances of control theory, and they do it in a very eloquent manner. And there's a little bit of their work I would like to share with you in relation to this particular topic and this slide. So they write, some proponents insist that control theory is entirely different from all other theories of crime because rather than trying to determine why some people deviate from social and legal norms. It asks, why does anyone conform? So why does anyone conform to a particular practice at all, right? They continue by writing, why don't we all violate the rules? Right? So it's kind of a different theoretical perspective. But as I said previously, the outcomes of this theoretical perspective are very much logical in nature. And I've given you some examples of that. They quote Hershey writing, or who writes, in the 1960s, in control theories, this question has never been adequately answered. The question remains, why do men obey the laws or the rules of society? He continues, deviance is taken for granted. Conformity must be explained. So that is the kind of the basis of social control theory. Why do people adhere to social and legal norms? And once we can identify that, we can then start to apply that in ways that restructure the order that people live within, or the social order of things. Because the premise is that there's a disorder and a disorganization, and people then are being motivated to act in ways that do not conform to social and legal norms. And so how do we curb that? So social control theorists will often recognize support practices as being central to the establishment of social control, or to return to a brand of social control that works. The other piece of the puzzle that Akers and Sellers also address in their work is the idea of social bonds and social bonding theory. Here, the attachment to others, how we attach to others, and whether or not our behaviors are social or antisocial is very, very important. So they write, attachment to others is the extent to which we have close, affectional ties to others. We admire them, and we identify with them so that we care about their expectations. This is kind of the social mirror of sorts. The idea here is that now we move beyond the individual to understand social control, and we look specifically at the kinds of bonds that that individual is making and what is communicated across those social bonds. So the idea here is that not only you are what you eat, but you are also a product of the people that you associate with. And you are a product, in this case, of the number of healthy social associations that you have. This is something that we probably have all heard at some point in our social development. Parents are a very good example of this. Parents will very often speak to their children about their friends, and parents will very often, and more often than not, become almost too involved in this friendship development process. But you can see, I think, why there is an emphasis made by parents. Parents have already moved through that phase of socialization. They have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to social bonds, and they have also seen what travels along those bonds and those associations. And so they are they're working from a very, very healthy and good place, but sometimes a young person will see that as a parent overstepping their bounds a little bit. But the idea here is that they want the best for their child, and they are trying to identify people in that child's social environment, and schools are a very good example of this, who will build a child up as opposed to, in this case, get a child involved in behaviors that lead to delinquency in some way, shape, or form. Now, as we start to apply social bonding theory, there is a process that, or a feedback, that then will begin to work on the individual again, and that feedback relates to self-control. The idea here is that as we start to develop healthier social bonds, as we start to look at the expectations of others around us, And this really expands well beyond the idea of friendships. As we start to get involved in other community organizations, church groups, things like that, we start to interact with people of a wide variety of ages, and people who are at a variety of points in their life histories. And we start to look at their expectations, and we start to develop control systems within ourselves. And so providing individuals with those opportunities is very, very important. And so the idea here is that there's another variable to measure here, which is self-control. We look at individuals, we look at their histories, and we say, does this person have a relatively low level of self-control, or does this person have a relatively high level of self-control? And what might be contributing to this, or what might be necessary to improve self-control at this point. And this takes us back to personality theory as well. The idea that, are we acting simply out of a place of selfishness and a lack of control, or are we being more altruistic? Are we recognizing ourselves in relation to the people around us? And are we thinking of others as we are participating in everyday activities? So the idea here is that um, healthy social bonds and social bonds that have a wide variety of experiences and of characteristics and qualities to them are things that will bolster self-control. It will allow us to think outside of ourselves more readily, and it will lead eventually to more checks and balances in the general conduct of people and their ultimately what they are contributing to the society around them.